For thousands of years, elders and knowledge keepers have used stories to educate future generations. Stories and words can help heal our hearts and make Mother Earth a better place for all people. This is Healing Hearts.
Hello everyone, I'm Tracy Koga and welcome to Healing Hearts. Well, tonight is a very special conversation. We are bringing Indigenous and Newcomer communities together and joining with the 2SLGBTQIA community so we can discuss how we can create a more inclusive society so everyone can be their true, authentic selves. Let's begin Healing Hearts. Hello everyone, it's so good to see you. Albert McLeod, thank you so much for joining us tonight. You are the president of Two-Spirited People of Manitoba. And my good friend, Cynthia Fortledge, thank you so much, girl, all the way from Chesham, England. It is now 1 a.m. in the morning, but I really wanted you to join in this conversation. You're the owner and founder of CAF Services and a gender identity coach. And yes, we are going to be talking about the Indigenous and Newcomer people that are part of this big community now, I think, the 2SLGBTQIA community. And I'm going to start with you, Albert, if possible.
Not sure.
Albert, you've been a long-time activist for human rights, a long-time supporter on these communities. And I'm going to start with you because I really wanted to talk and learn more about the Indigenous and part of this story, and especially Two-Spirited people. So maybe share your story and where you are now.
Sure. Well, my ancestry is very much a colonial history one for Manitoba, in that the sort of European side and the McLeod side came from Scotland in the late 1800s to be a part of the Hudson Bay Company Fur Trade. And they soon married with the local Indigenous women, who were the Cree women, whose families were also working in the fur trade. So my cultural identity is a very mixed one of European, Canadian, as well as Indigenous people who lived on the land historically, as well as were part of the sort of assimilation period after contact with Europeans, whether it was the Red River Settlement or York Factory in northern Manitoba on the Hudson's Bay. So that goes back about 7 or 8 generations now. Mm-hmm. And growing up in the north, in the Paw, which was a relatively small town, there was no real reflections in the 60s and 70s of anybody being gay. And if there was, it certainly wasn't a positive point of view, because we know with colonization, it really introduced, the idea of binary male and female, and a lot of that was supported by Christian belief systems. And in those days, different institutions had a lot of power, whether you were government, an Indian agent, or we all understand the impact of Indian residential schools, which were very much about assimilation of Indigenous minds to a, Euro-Christian point of view that was very binary specific. That, there was the ideal male, ideal female, and there was no other socially sanctioned representation, and certainly nothing about homosexuality or, lesbianism or those kind of things, and certainly no support for transgender identities. So that's where I grew up. I ended up in Vancouver just as HIV had sort of reached North America, and I managed to survive that until I returned home to Manitoba in 1983, and I've been here ever since. And as we all know with COVID, you can't outrun viruses, pandemic viruses, and I couldn't outrun HIV either, because eventually it reached Manitoba. And so that's been some of my work, is really addressing Indigenous education around HIV and other sexually transmitted infections, as well as the experience of Indigenous lesbian, gays, bisexual, and trans people historically and in contemporary society. So we began our organization in 1986, just before Winnipeg had its first official Gay Pride March in 1987. And that sort of coincided when there was an amendment to the Human Rights Act that prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation. Later on, gender identity was included by Manitoba legislative. So for me, as a survivor of homophobia and transphobia in the North, as well as the AIDS pandemic, and then living in Winnipeg and working in the Indigenous community, it's been a lot of work about education, outreach, and advocacy. It's whether there's advocacy with our own Indigenous leaders or advocacy with our provincial government or federal government about our inclusion. And you will see with the recent murdered and missing inquiry into murdered and missing women and girls, that after they began the inquiry process, they expanded it to include 2SLGBTQIA people, which really for me is a representation of decolonization, as well as reconciling an Indigenous view of gender identity or diversity in that kind of case, where historically LGBT people were included in the community and there wasn't this sort of overt homophobia or transphobia prior to contact with Europeans. So we were just recently funded by the federal government for a year-and-a-half project around capacity building after the Prime Minister apologized in November 2017 for this history of homophobia and transphobia as a component of Canada's colonial era. So, and really understanding that we do need capacity building because we're a community that has been neglected for a very long time. And we're just starting to, build our social supports for our own community here in Manitoba. So that's me.
Oh, and there's so much more. Albert, can you maybe talk about two-spirited people, from an Indigenous culture point of view?
Well, what we know in the various languages of the different tribal groups that existed here at the time of contact, within those, and there was 1,000 languages here, so that really talked to the long habitation of humans to develop over 1,000 distinct languages. Well, what we know from the sort of historians is that there was 156 Indigenous words or terms that describe gay people or trans people. So it really was the extent of that inclusion. And as well, we know with the Indian residential school era, that was an attempt to force Christianity onto Indigenous minds, particularly children. So in that era, which was over 100 years, there was really no space for gay people, right? Because children were sort of socialized to be heterosexual, and that was the only acceptable identity. So it was about spirit, right? And so prior to contact with the Europeans, Indigenous people would have spirit names, right? Or they would practice a particular spirituality depending on their culture. And so in the erasure of Indigenous gay people, it was kind of an erasure of spirituality, right? And that representation or that link to our natural world, the link to our community. So it really wasn't erase us. So in our resurgence in the last 40 years, it is about reclaiming our spiritual identity, our relationship to the natural world, our relationship to the Indigenous spiritual world, and then our relationship to our families and our relationship to our communities and nations. So that's kind of where the spirit comes into the larger conversation around the broader LGBTQ community, because that's a very political term, right? In terms of the liberation movement in the 60s and 70s, where spirituality was not much of that conversation then. And I think for us as Indigenous gay people, it's our contribution to the movement. And I like to characterize it like we were the first gays of America, right? Thousands of years ago, right?
So this is
And you
all
can see what the act.
this is old
We were
news.
decorating a long time ago. We were decorating a long time.
Oh, Albert, well, thank you. We're definitely going to get more into that conversation. I want to welcome Mohammed. Thank you so much for joining us, Mohammed Hassan. You're like a career coach and we know for diversity and inclusion facilitator for Manitoba Start. But more importantly, I think you know some of these people. You know Cynthia from her days back with the Rainbow Resource Center, and yourself, a former Pride Winnipeg president, and doing the Pride Parade. Wow. I mean, we miss it. It's probably going to not be happening again this year too, Mohammed?
Yeah, and I just would like to add that, you know, it's an absolute honor to share the forum with Elder Albert here as well. You know, like from the very early days of me being in Canada, um, you know, under their guidance and support, I've learned a lot. So it's not just like I have both the panelists here are, you know, a very near and dear one to me in terms of guiding me and supporting me. Being a newcomer, I only moved to Canada in 2016, so it's and yeah, we are not having one anytime soon, you know, because of the COVID.
Yeah.
So.
So, Mohammed, maybe share your story now as a newcomer. And yeah, and so recently I did not know. And, you know, sort of your path and journey on creating a life for yourself here.
Yep. So, of course, Canada, for many immigrants and you know, refugees, it has always been a destination of choice for several reasons. Because you know, we see it from an external lens, and you know, everything looks really, really good until you come to the country and you see that there are, you know, lots of intersectionality that are still struggling. You know, so when I moved here in 2016, I decided that, you know, like from the day one, I will be, you know, very active in community activism, and I will take part in any social action project that I can come across, and I'll, you know, I'll try my best to be frontline and center of everything that I can find. And you know, Cynthia's nods and Albert's smile is kind of giving it away that I tried to do that. But as you know, like I interacted more and more with um, larger community members across Canada. Um, I realized that, you know, there are so many intersectionalities that are still not in the mainstream of the whole celebration. You know, like let it be, you know, from you know, Two-Spirit community in particular, and also you know, our Indigenous siblings generally from every aspect of life, and of course trans and non-binary community members. The struggles are real, even like this is 2021, and still the struggles are real. While we do have huge celebration of diversity and inclusion, and we love doing everything that is related to that, I felt that probably rather than being in the front lines, I need to take few steps back and probably start working on more policy advocacy work, and you know, support organizations in understanding what is important, how to, you know, like create change that is more sustainable. So that's all I've been doing lately.
I was going to quickly ask you, Mohammed, how have you changed since being here in Canada, in Winnipeg maybe in particular, with your own, you know, gender equality and, you know, coming out, so to speak?
So as far as my personal journey is concerned, like I said earlier as well, that I have started seeing it from a very different lens. When I was coming to Canada, my biggest, you know, idea that I had in mind was, everything will be so perfect. And, like moving from Pakistan to Canada, I like for the last month when I was there, I still remember March 2016 was the month when I moved here. So the whole of February, all I can think of was, how amazing everything will be and how, equality based everything is going to be. And for some reason I thought that as soon as I'm going to land on at Toronto airport, the whole airport will break into a flash mob and people will start dancing and say welcome to the country. That didn't happen, of course. But what also did not happen is that I realized that there has been lots of intersectional community members who have been here for generations, uh, and who are still fighting, struggling, battling, any kind of vocabulary that I can find, um, to find the space to be themselves, uh, and to find the space that that they deserve. That should be everyone's birthright. And then again, I'm going to take it back to our, Indigenous and Two-Spirit community members, because, like that was for me, it was a reality check that, like an eye opener for me was as a newcomer that this is an Indigenous land, and living in Manitoba, living in Canada, which is actually Turtle Island, we all need to understand the realities of how our Indigenous siblings have been treated for ages in this systemic challenges. And I should not, move be tiptoeing around it. Systemic racism and systemic barriers to discrimination. So of course, my worldview changed to a point where I realized that probably my personal battle as a newcomer is not that important. That I need to take few steps back and see it from the lens of those who have been living here for thousands of generations.
No, very powerful, and it's very, very, very interesting observation, Mohammed. And we're going to continue. I want to go to Cynthia, but I want to actually we have a question from our viewers out there. Maybe Albert, you might want to answer this one. How has the LGBTQ community been treated by law enforcement? Oh, you'll just have to unmute yourself.
Canada has a history, and that was sort of one of the drivers of this apology. Was, we know historically it was about the purge. It's called the purge, where civil servants could be fired if they were known to be gay or lesbian or trans. People from the military could be ousted. Civil servants could be ousted. So I think in Canada's colonial history, monitoring of us as citizens has really been a part of the state responsibility, especially in the West. We know with the Northwest Rebellion and that suppression with Louis Riel, that we've been over-policed, and just with in Toronto with the raids on the bathhouse. So our sexuality has been under attack, for the police for a very long time, hand in hand with whether it's a federal or provincial policing system, that, we've been monitored and in many ways ridiculed and shamed, and many times, discriminated against. Like I said, you could lose your job in those days. Even up to that time in 1986, a civil servant in Manitoba could have been fired, right, if they were known to be gay. And so, Canada didn't repeal some aspects of the criminalization of being homosexual until 1969. So it's a society that's very recent. And we can see with this rise of fascism in the US and other parts of the world, and in Canada as well, the sort of hypermasculinity and these old ideas about men have to be strong, you know, men have to have control of society, and that anything different is sort of has to be, you know, squashed. And so you can really always see you have to be vigilant in a so-called democratic society. And like Mohammed says, you always have to be fighting for your rights and letting people know we have equal rights in our constitution, in our legislation, right? And these are the laws of society. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, we have federal laws that prohibit discrimination based on gender identity, as well as provincial laws. So these are not just policies. Canadians need to know these are the laws of the people, and that you cannot discriminate, right? And there are repercussions if you do discriminate, you know. And so it really is a steep learning curve for many who are not used to that, again, because the sort of gender identity has been sort of, as Mohammed said, generationally, you know, pounded into our society, where it's very hard for people to have perspective, to see something, society as structured maybe differently and more functionality, right? Or more functioning better, right? So hopefully when we come out of this pandemic, all of our societies will have changed somewhat and be functioning better than we were before.
Well, that's interesting. So yeah, we'll get onto that topic of what post-pandemic is going to look like for the community as well. But I'm going to go to my dear friend Cynthia. Cynthia, I was thinking, as Albert was saying, that, you know, men have to be strong, they have to be powerful, they have to be leaders, and I was going to ask an opening question for you, Cynthia. What is your favorite season?
All of the patriarchy. So, I mean, just to be clear, the patriarchy is a system. And it's a system that men are victims of too, because when we see toxic masculinity and so forth, it is an outcome from a patriarchal system. And so we know that that system creates the imbalance. And, you know, I like to say we don't need another equality law. As Albert's spoken so well to, as he always does, this whole concept of we have these laws federally and provincially. What we need is equity, because those laws are not being felt by the people on the streets living day to day. And so that becomes the challenge to society, is how do you create equity? Because equity is not equal, right? So, you know, I always use the example for people that are aware of it. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was a rash of murders of the gay male community in Toronto. And one of the reports had talked about, well, the police were regularly patrolling the areas. Equally, everywhere was getting the same service, but not everywhere needed the same service. Equity says redeploy those resources to serve those that need it. And when they can actually enjoy a level of equality, you can go back and look equitably at how you redistribute that service or that delivery. And it applies to everything. It applies to medical services, protection of people. It is, you know, mental health services. It's the entire gamut. And the problem is we have equality, but we definitely don't have equity. And that's the challenge in front of us.
Yes. Well, we just got a question, and I think maybe you answered it, because they were asking, what is the difference between equity and equality, and why is that so important? But I think you just mentioned that, Cynthia. Yes. So, you know what? I've heard your story. It is, to me, I never tire of it. But again, you know, your personal journey, Cynthia, has been awe-inspiring, but also it's been a movement. I think you've created a movement.
Well, in terms of trying to create the movement about acceptance without understanding, as a way for communities to perhaps process these challenges that they might perceive of oppressed persons. Every group we've talked about here are oppressed in the Canadian environment. So they're globally oppressed is the reality. So the challenge is, how do you accept? Like, people may go, well, you know, and what, you know, Elder Albert had talked about is like, they don't need to understand his backstory in order to accept that what he's sharing with them is his lived truth and experience, right? Same with Muhammad. I don't need to go to Pakistan to understand the environment Muhammad came from in order to accept that that's his story and it's created this piece. So we need to continue to challenge, and people do not need to understand why my life went through the journey that it did. I'm a unique individual. We all are. Our lives are all therefore unique. So you can't expect any aspect of my life to be the same as yours just because you're uncomfortable. The only thing you can do is to accept it, because we do not have the power to change other people. And that, I think, is one of the challenges that people, they feel like, you know, maybe if I argue this more, maybe if I argue this louder, maybe if I get more angry, that will make people agree with me. And it's not about agreeing, it's about accepting, because that's how we get together. Because until you accept, we can't have the dialogue to talk to Albert and Muhammad and the communities that they work with and go, how do we get this right? Because if not, what you have is one group coming in and going, what do you mean this isn't this way? And it's like, they're coming from a place of power, and therefore they're oppressing, in just the statement of that, they're oppressing the communities who in fact actually need the support. So acceptance says you come in and you create the space to have the dialogue. And if you don't, that dialogue is never going to occur. So acceptance is the process by which we get there, and we have to begin to do it without understanding. But when we open that door and begin to communicate, we can grow to acceptance with understanding, because we've taken the time to talk and to learn and to grow together.
Wow. Cynthia, I was going to ask you too, because you have been traveling, but safely though. And I mean, this was your dream before the pandemic and COVID-19 squashed a lot of those plans. But you have done some traveling. Through your travels and meeting different people in the communities there, what have you learned? Who has gotten it right, so to speak? I mean, I don't think it's ever perfect, or has nothing really changed?
It's a really interesting question, because I don't know if we should be asking who's got it right, because I think you're right. Nobody's gotten it right. I would say who seems to be on a better path. So, you know, when I compare, and again, you know, I look at both the women's movement as well as the 2SLGBTQIA plus community. And, you know, when I was in, for instance, in South America, they actually use a series of colored banners to represent. So if you ever watch a protest in South America, you will see the participants wearing colored banners. And so for kind of, quote, the generic LGBT communities, they wear a rainbow banner. But within the women's movement, there's both a purple and a green banner between women's movement and the rights of abortion. They're actually completely separate topics within those countries. And I contrast that to where I'm now in the UK, and I would say the UK, certainly not perfect. I see it in the news every day, but I would say they're at least 10 years, 15 years ahead of where Canada is at today, at least based upon where it was when I left in 2019.
Wow.
And it's really intriguing to see that. What hit me just walking down the street, interacting, seeing people in jobs and roles and was the diversity in the workforce in roles that, you know, I don't know the stats of, say, how many Black police officers does Winnipeg have, but I can tell you at least half of the force here are not of British white origin. And therefore they more closely resemble the communities they're serving. That's a big step. Are they perfect? No, they're nowhere. But they've at least made that progress. But everywhere I go, I talk to banking. I mean, in Winnipeg, in 30 years of doing business, I primarily did business with white business people. That's the Winnipeg business community. I think maybe it's 10, 15% here. Like the balance is just better, right? So that's what 10, 15 years, but it's come at a high cost of the protests that we watched through the 80s and the 90s, the rashes of murders that have occurred. So it's not without a cost, and it's not without loss. It's not without, you know, getting it right, but it's better.
Yeah.
And I would say that that's what we need to look at. But, you know, when I look at it as a transgender woman, I can't be married in my birthplace of Northern Ireland. I can in England, but I can't in Northern Ireland. The laws are different. And they don't recognize that right, even though they're part of the UK. And it's just part of the complexity. Yet, when I was traveling in South America, a number of those countries, for instance, had same-sex marriage laws that were passed. So you would say, well, compared to Northern Ireland, they're doing way better.
Yeah.
But Mohammed, I think, said it right. These are all basic human rights. And this concept that people talk about of, well, what do you mean? You've got marriage, you've got this, you could adopt and whatever. It's like, okay, but if I can't walk down the street holding the hand of my partner or giving them a kiss, and you can, and as trite as that is an example, that clearly tells you we're not living in an equal place. And so what do we need to do to make that okay, so that I don't think I'm going to be killed if I do that? Because that's exactly the way it feels today.
Well, yeah. Well, we'll get back to you, Cynthia, because I want to talk about, you know, creating a safe space, because I know that you have a lot of knowledge. Albert, I'm going to ask you a question, and Mohammed too, because we're going to bring it back here to our own city. You know, how inclusive are we now? I mean, we have come, you know, a ways, but Albert, as far as for the two-spirited people, how far have we come in making it inclusive or more inclusive for them?
Well, I think, you know, after 30 years, we're beginning to see some shift and change, some ownership from Indigenous organizations. Like every other week, I am approached by an organization for a workshop or some training for their staff, because they want to provide appropriate support or, you know, program. And I'm hoping for the day that, you know, they will start to recognize they can have their own two-spirit program at their organization. So that's the level of inclusion, because they have youth programs, they have parent programs, but they need to realize they travel within a few blocks of their home, right? So it's going to be a program that's either close by, where there's a comfort level with their neighborhood, and it really should be in an organization. So I've seen some shift, but I've also seen some sort of digging in of heels, right? Where people, especially in the political arena, where, you know, accepting two-spirit or Indigenous LGBTQ is a political liability, and you kind of want to go with the crowd, right? And so there's a lot of ghosting that happens, a lot of gaslighting. And fortunately for us, like, we're having two big elections, the Assembly of First Nations, their national chief, and for Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, their Assembly, I forget what it's called, chief, he's a grand chief. And so that's where we lobby, and that's where we ask the questions, like, how are you going to champion the rights of two-spirit people who are your constituents, right? Who actually vote for your chief and council, who elects you, right? So we may put it on the agenda as a political discussion, right? Because if people want to represent their nation or their community politically, you can't pick and choose, right? It has to be everybody. Everybody has, you know, in this case, treaty rights, you know, civil rights, constitutional rights, And and that's been our tactic in the last few years. And many times we don't get an answer, right? That because people feel it's too politically charged and they want to be leaders, but they don't want to lead everybody, obviously. So we're keeping up under pressure, and we will be doing it this year.
Oh, wow. That's amazing just to learn all of this. Mohammed, for yourself, a newcomer, and I'm sure back home, right, you were part of the oppressed community. Now, do you help other newcomers when they come here too, as well, to adjust? And what kind of supports are, how can we help too to make their transition a bit easier?
So I just want to add what Albert was saying earlier. Of course, Albert has seen everything that has happened in terms of the moment, not just in Winnipeg, but nationally as well, and even in the whole North American region. But when I see it from my newcomer lens, I see that there's not much done. And in fact, like I would agree with Albert on this, that people think these things are very politically charged, not understanding that diversity, acceptance, feeling of belonging, these are human rights. There's nothing political about it. Everyone deserves to feel that they are loved, they are owned, and they are accepted. So definitely there's a lot of room for understanding in not just in political circles, but also in our mainstream masses. And again, I'm being generous in saying mainstream masses. I should say white, cisgender, male masses that we have, taken over. The group that has taken over almost every moment, not just within the community, but generally everywhere else. Coming to the newcomers' perspective, I see that there was a time when things were moving forward and there were lots of programming being offered by several agencies, but then all of a sudden, uh, nothing. When Cynthia was president for the Community Resource Center, there was, an amazing program being offered for newcomers, which is not there now. Sometimes people ask me if I can volunteer some time to assist a newcomer, and I love doing that. But by the end of the day, institution should be held accountable for missing on those areas. But like I said, our Indigenous siblings are still fighting for their rights. Newcomers, we are way at the back of the lane. But at the same time, uh, how we can help is by pushing hard, for advocating, for making spaces for people to, raise their voices, like space like this, where, like I don't think it's been ages since I've spoken so openly and criticized the Community Resource Center for missing on the newcomers programming. But this is the reality, an unfortunate reality. I just also want to add one thing, because when I was listening to all these amazing things that are being said, is like we still have oppressive laws, like one thing that I'm sure most of us who are born and raised in Canada might not experience is that Canadian immigration laws for spousal visas is very heteronormative, very cis-normative. There's no way for people to easily get through that process and bring their spouses and significant others to Canada, regardless of how qualified they are, how much productive they're going to be. They're never considered as the right applicants. So that's one example of how many laws still needs to be changed. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you, Mohammed. So we have a question. I'm going to give it to all of you. And the question is, what sort of impacts are there on the mental health of the 2SLGBTQIA community when they don't have the safe places to go to? Cynthia?
Yeah, that's that's a heavy question, because for the most part, certainly for those within the gender identity spectrum, but not solely, suicide is the way out. And when you look to youth, and I believe that was defined as under 24, we're talking suicide rates as high as 60 odd percent last I looked. And when you look at, you know, the quote cisgender community of the same age group, it's 4% nationally. So you got to kind of question if it's 4% is kind of the national average, but this other community is 60%, that kind of is telling you there's an imbalance and equality doesn't exist. The equity is not being felt. And I think that probably, for me, is one of the harshest things, because it represents a part of my own journey that I've been through and that I've gone through, which is one of the things that I let youth know, that I've made it through that. It doesn't come at no cost, because even at my age, at 50 plus, we're talking about at least an attempted suicide of almost 50%. 50%. A 50, like, I just get exasperated. I mean, the numbers haven't changed. And what's changed? Not much, because we're still not providing the basic services. The community's still unemployed or underemployed. And I think that would probably speak to all of the communities represented here, but I will certainly let each of the distinguished panelists speak for their community. But yeah, it's not good, Tracy. It's not good.
Yeah, we did some research here among Two-Spirit, gay, bisexual, and queer men in Manitoba. And one of the findings, and it was Dr. Rusty Solomonov from the University of Manitoba, and it was sort of equal representation of people on the degrees of being out.
Oh, he's real.
Degree, like totally out to like totally not out. And this is in Manitoba, where over 50% of people did not feel comfortable being out about their gay identity. So it really talks to the mental health issues that people have, where they don't feel safe socially or in employment to be who they are, right? To express their relationship with a partner, you know, to come to a work environment with their partner and have that acknowledged and respected, where they still feel they have to hide or pretend to be heterosexual, which is really what that's about. And so I never discount that Manitoba is a colony, even though it's been 200 years. We're very conservative, whichever government we have.
Albert, you just frozen for a bit there, Albert. Well, we'll come back to him. Mohammed, do you want to comment?
Definitely. One thing that Albert is back, so please.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I just want to say that we're, you know, we are narrow-minded, right? And we don't really, for myself, you know, the Indigenous belief is that every human has a purpose, a role, a destiny, and carries a divine gift. And that's regardless of your sexual orientation or your gender identity. That was a fundamental philosophy of Indigenous peoples. And that's why they included everybody, because they recognize this journey that we're on is spiritual and it's in many ways sacred. And we should all recognize that and not oppress people. Like, you know, I think the homophobia and transphobia is not so overt, but I think the mental health issues are exacerbated by the soft type of discrimination where people are excluded, as I mentioned, ghosted or gaslighted, where they feel it. They feel it at sort of a psychological, spiritual level, that they are being treated differently and that they're being treated less than. right? And so I think that really affects people's mental health, their feeling of self-worth, their confidence, and those kind of things. And so that's what I really fight against, is that more subtle discrimination of exclusion, which itself is against the law in Canada, right? So.
Mohammed?
Yeah, I would just build on what was just said by Cynthia and Albert. Mental health challenges is the biggest thing that newcomers also experience. The exclusion, the isolation is a reality. And then add another layer of moving to a new place, especially when it's branded as a utopia where everything is going to be perfect, everything is going to be so much in place that it breaks your heart to a point where you don't really like. And I've heard many stories where people choose to not talk about their identities and experiences because they really don't feel safe. But at the same time, there are things that are moving in the right direction. While I criticize one organization, I should take this liberty to praise another community-led organization, Sunshine House, for doing a lot of work for newcomer individuals, and most of the volunteers and staff there is uh, Indigenous and Two-Spirit identified. So there are good things happening. As for newcomer, and if I just speak for myself, I found peace in interacting with Two-Spirit community more, because probably I had this common ground of colonized identity, and also the other community groups that I felt more connected with is definitely trans and non-binary community. And I'm not just saying that because I have two distinguished panelists sharing the forum with me, but that's the reality. And of course, the lack of belonging, the sense of the feeling of that you're not wanted is the most difficult feeling. And Cynthia was courageous enough to use the S word. I feel that, like, yes, even newcomer feel, very suicidal at some point in their life because of the lack of acceptance, the lack of understanding, and this constant spotlight of explaining their position. Why are you doing this? This is not how it's done in Canada. This is not our way. But then stop saying that our ways are diversified ways, because if we have to follow one particular type of action, one particular style of doing things, then it's not diversity. It's just white-centered approach.
No. Okay. Mohammed, do you think you want to run for like mayor maybe, or
Prime Minister one
Prime
day.
Minister? Oh, yeah. Hey, silly me. I know. Just go for the big one. Yeah. And then our country would be fine. I want to talk now about youth, because I think youth are very, very important. And Cynthia, you praised youth in all of our other conversations, but youth now that are in the 2SLGBTQIA community and whatever other communities are out there. We've talked now about feeling the shame. We've just talked now with no safe place, suicidal thoughts. What kind of future can we build to be inclusive and support the youth? Because they are going to be our future. Cynthia.
Well, as I've said before, the first thing we have to do is get out of their way. They are not future leaders. They are the leaders of today. And we just need to hand it over to them and be there to take all our perceived knowledge and insight in mostly colonized processes that we've been given and raised in, and help them wherever it's needed. But they are truly the leaders today. And I would say that, not to change kind of the theme of it, but the reality is that we have one overarching major concern, and the youth know this, and that is environmentally. Because if we destroy this planet, nothing else matters. And the youth get that. And on top of protecting the planet and making sure we have a place to live, then it is on the foundation of that that we create this equitable support for everyone, and that they get in spades too, right? We just need to get out of their way, and we need to allow the favorite season of fall of the patriarchy to occur and allow them to bring in the new systems and values, societal values that will drive this change. Mm-hmm. The more that we stay in there protecting this white privileged space that we live in, and certainly, you know, been able to work with Mohammed when I was at Rainbow Resource Center, along with Albert, that was one of the things I walked away with, was being more aware of my privilege. As a white person, it doesn't matter that I'm transgender, my skin color covers a huge amount of privilege. And my job is to shut up, get out of the way, and allow others to step into that space. And I'll do that right now.
Albert?
Yeah, in the Indigenous community, we're seeing a whole new generation of Indigenous queer leaders who are writers, authors. Joshua Whitehead, you know, just won Canada 2020 with Reads, you know, so they're winning awards, right? They're making films, you know, rap, they're poets, and they're activists on the pipelines, and, you know, they're at every level. And they're teaching us, right? They're teaching us about concepts like non-binary and all of these things that, you know, our generation never experienced. And for many of us, it's a learning curve for us as well, right? So their creativity and their day-to-day experience is something that's educating for us. But I just want to share a story at the most recent Pride, which is a couple of years ago now. I ran into a youth I worked with at an organization called Gani Gani Chip. And we were, after leaving, you know, the event at the forts, and we got on the same bus, and he was at the front, and he turns to me and he says, "Hi, Mama." He says, "This is my partner," right? And that was it, right? That he doesn't have to be alone. He found someone who loves him, right? And they can have a home together, and that's what it was all about, right? It's about family and connection and nurturing and love, right? And someone else is going to pay the bill or take the laundry out or whatever, right? So you're not isolated, you know, struggling on your own. You are a couple, and you're experiencing our society from that vantage point. And so I thought, to me, it was very demonstrative of that hope or vision that we had for the youth, that they would not be alone, that they would be living their best life.
Oh, wow, we certainly hope so. Mohammed?
Yeah, I think we should, most of us should, you know, take a step back and let our youth take over. You know, and the classic example is the environmental change and the global change movement, not just globally, but here in Winnipeg as well. Like, you know, a group of school students led that movement, and they were so young and, you know, more energetic and more aware than most of us were or still are. Also, I think that, you know, youth has so much potential, and they have probably more energy than some of us. You know, like Albert used the term gas lighted or burnt. Most of us, we in our journey and struggle, it's getting tiring to a point that we need fresh, you know, energy, fresh blood, fresh ideas. And I think most of the organizations, including the senior government level organization, should be given to the future generation, even if it's for a small period of time, to test. And I can bet on it, that I can bet my life that youth will create miracles if they were given an opportunity.
Oh, well, we do have another question, and so it's going to go to everybody. If you were only able to give one piece of advice to someone who is struggling to find their place, what would you say? Albert.
Can I take this one?
Oh, you can take this one, yeah.
No, just be yourself. If one piece of advice I want to give, just be yourself. You know, don't worry what others around you are thinking about you. What your surrounding is making, whether or not they're judging you or not. The ultimate thing that's important for you is your self-acceptance. And if you can accept yourself, then everything else does not matter. Nothing matters.
Beautiful. Albert.
Yeah, I think what I learned from my grandmother, who was a Cree woman, she was born in 1987. She never spoke English. She was brown. She was not accepted in Canadian society. But you know what? She didn't care. Because she knew, right, that her existence was from something bigger. It was intentional. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. Her existence on this natural world that we all live in was intentional, right? And it's something to celebrate. It's beautiful, you know, and that's what I tell the youth, right? You're not a mistake. You're intentional. You're part of a larger design, and we may never know what that design is, and we don't need to know. All you need to know is that you're intentional and you're gifted, and you know, you should celebrate your life, whatever it is.
Oh, beautiful. And Cynthia?
I just want the youth to know that in the moments they struggle and they question themselves, listen to Muhammad, listen to Albert, and know that you are more than enough. You are amazing. And when you doubt it, just know that I'm out here and I know that you are so amazing.
Wow. And then another question popped up. So I might try to paraphrase it. I'm not too sure, but I think what they're trying to ask us, have there been ways or what has been tried to educate without a threat to the larger community? And I guess maybe it's, Albert, I guess, to the larger community, us, in being inclusive and learning more. Have there been ways to educate us?
Well, Indigenous people are pragmatic. They use common sense and they use reason, right? And so if you are a citizen of the nation, that's how you should be treated, right? As a person with inherent, inalienable, civil, constitutional, and treaty rights, right? So use your common sense. And why is that should not be threatening to anybody, right? Mm-hmm. It's common sense.
And that's what they said. To educate the larger community without them feeling threatened. So Muhammad, too?
I think there have been multiple attempts made from different community leaders, facilitators. Albert has been training and facilitating lots of these conversations. Cynthia is, doing it not just locally but internationally. I have done my fair share, a small bit of training and educating masses. But of course, sometimes these conversations will come off as, slightly uncomfortable. And the reason why people will feel uncomfortable about these conversations is because we have biases. It's because those biases are so much embedded in our system that it's impossible. I have been in situation where I wanted to say is that, oh, by the way, that's your white fragility or cis fragility or heterofragility, speaking. None of that, what I'm trying to explain, it has anything to do with uh, you. It has everything to do with how my community and my people and people like myself are treated. So yeah.
Cynthia, I'm going to let you comment on bias.
We have another hour.
Yeah, we might.
Yeah. So you know what? It's intriguing because in that question, what stood out to me was this idea of a threat. And Mohammed's absolutely right. It is that we come with bias, but really let's step back and think about that for a second. Because what bias is saying, and look, we're all human, we all have bias. I have bias. So none of us are, quote, perfect without bias. And the whole idea is that is a filter that we look at something, and the bias says that what is in, what is out. In other words, we're making judgment of how people fit. And again, remember, go back to when we talk about human beings, we're all unique, and therefore our journeys, our paths are all unique. And as Albert so eloquently spoke to, we all bring unique gifts. We've all been given a gift that's unique to bring. So how can we expect everybody to fit into this bias of being alike? Alike because of color, language, sexuality, gender identity? Like, it really makes it, very complicated, where we need to move away from that concept that should be non-threatening, right? This is not a pie. And if you give me, a piece of pie, you don't have that piece of pie. These are rights. And equity says that we need to move that around until everyone enjoys it equally. And if somebody's not getting it, yeah, they're going to have it much longer. There is going to be this equitable distribution of whatever it happens to be, finance, services, support, you name it. So the idea of being threatened is already saying, I'm being threatened with the idea of losing something that, Mohammed started off, and Albert and the Indigenous community know that we are all colonizers. Every one of us are colonizers on this land. This was not our land. Winnipeg is on Treaty 1 land. They get their water from Treaty 7 land. Like, get over it. It's not your land. So what are you afraid of? Are you afraid of changing societal values? So are you afraid of change? So it just gets so frustrating to see that people have this idea of, oh God, you're changing my world. But think back to, their youth to where they are now. And the world has done nothing but constantly change. And this is the era that we're in. And these are the topics that we're talking about. And the communities who, guess what? They've been oppressed, for over 50 years or more. And, hundreds of years when we talk about the Indigenous community. So the key here is to realize that what we're doing is, yeah, you might be afraid, upset, but you're really challenging your own biases that you hold of why you think this is the way things are, and what way are we challenging you in the change. It says more about you having to question yourself as to why those trigger the concept of a threat, more so than recognizing us as human beings who have an inalienable right of human rights.
And she drops the mic. I have one last question, sorry, before we go. Yes, we are in a pandemic and it's so long, and we are all so frustrated and isolated and everything like that. So if you had one wish, if once the doors open and we fly outside, what change would you like to see happen? Albert.
Yeah, you know what? I think it would really be to create those safer spaces for the youth, right? Because now we're so far away from them. You know, like we don't know what's happening out there. Like because people are not going out there, we don't know where they are. So really, it would really focus is to bring, because they've been affected by this pandemic, right? There's less services, closed doors. People are not there that used to be there, like Mohammed had said. And so really it is to reach out to that younger generation and let them talk about what they've gone through, what insights they've got, and what they value post-pandemic. What do they value? Because again, they are the ones that are leading us and telling us about their experience and then what they need, right? So really is that focus of, creating that space for these conversations to happen and have those supports there.
Thank you. Mohammed?
One thing that I wish not post-pandemic, but during this pandemic is that specifically when speaking of newcomers, not just newcomers, but community at large as well, don't stop connecting with people. When we talk about newcomers, most of us don't have families, friends, anyone here. And, and then the isolation of this pandemic, it takes everything away from us that was, giving us some hope. And I've been in touch with lots of other newcomers, as well as people who were born and raised in Canada. And everyone feels that, they're in sort of a limbo situation, phone book or any social media account, and you have not checked in with them for a while. Ask them how they're doing. Ask them how they're feeling, because you never know that one text would be lifesaver for someone.
Okay, I'm going to pick up my phone right now. No, no, I have to ask Cynthia. Go ahead. That's beautiful, Mohammed.
You know what? I mean, I think that, Albert's right. It's on the youth, and Mohammed, focus on our community at large. And Tracy, you've heard me say it before. I don't want to go back to the way things were. I can hardly wait till they go back. No, I want to go forward for things being better. And so I don't trust the agencies and systems that exist today to make the world better. But I do trust putting it in the hands of youth to create communities that will make this world better.
Wow. So we look towards a new and better tomorrow. I just want to say thank you to all of you, Albert, Mohammed, and Cynthia. This has been like an amazing conversation, and I think that if we all take one thing away, we will be working towards a better and more inclusive society, like I said at the beginning, so everyone can be their true, authentic selves. So thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and Cynthia, well, should I say good morning now? Thank you so much. It's been wonderful, and again, I want to thank Immigration Partnership Winnipeg and Elder Clayton Sandy. They're the co-creators of Healing Hearts, and I want to continue this conversation, and hopefully we can create, like Elder Albert said, one of those safe places for our youth. So thank you, and good night.
Right.